The Olympics is one of the greatest sporting extravaganzas that is there on the planet. I mean, where on earth will you get 200 plus nations participating with a chance to get glory? But the unfortunate byproduct that the Olympics has spawned also comes with certain developments that's happening in the geopolitical world. In the times of Olympics, especially in 2024 now, you've got two wars that has threatened world peace. And because of that, you may think, oh, the Olympics has been held at a troubled time. But in this video, I will tell you that the Olympics has always been held in the backdrop of certain wars, terrorism, social issues that have erupted at this point. It is not for the first time that an Olympics has had a troubled build-up, if you look at it. Sure, security issues are unprecedented, but the backdrop of this Paris 2024 thing is an unfortunate sign of the times that we live in. But has this been the case for the first time? Actually, no, because when the 1956 Olympics was going to be held in Melbourne, at that time, two major wars had broken out. If you look at it, two major events had happened. 1956, you saw the Suez crisis erupt, in which Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt at that time, he decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. And because of that, Britain, Israel, France, they invaded Egypt so that this would not be done. Egypt had also sent suicide squads into Gaza, and that is why Israel had to retaliate also. But all of the Suez crisis, when it happened for that brief moment, saw several nations boycotting the Olympics in protest of what happened with Israel, France and Britain, what they did with Egypt. But another event which really put this into the back burner happened in Budapest. The 1956 Hungarian uprising saw the Hungarians clash with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union invaded Hungary because Hungary wanted to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. And because of that, Soviet Union just invaded them. It was a brutal crushing of the uprising, which also culminated in hostilities even in the Olympics. There was the water polo game between Hungary and the USSR in the semi-final. At one point in time, one of the Russian athletes threw a punch at a Hungarian athlete, and that was when the famous blood in the water match happened. The crowd became so hostile that they almost threatened to overrun the Russian athletes, but police intervention ensured that whatever happened stayed there, and that's why there was no ugly incident afterwards. After that, the Hungarian athletes defected to the West because they didn't want to come back into the Soviet bloc. And that is why this was the peak. 1956 was the peak of what could happen. Geopolitical tensions combined with Olympics being hosted. Hungarian Revolution and Suez Crisis. 12 years later, when the Olympics shifted to Mexico City, at that time, there were two major incidents happening. One was the American civil rights movement, in which black power was being demonstrated. And if you look at this iconic image, the 1968 Olympics, when the American sprinters won, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, they got the gold and the bronze medals. They decided to raise the black fist. And that was the solidarity with which American society was moving at that point in time. The 60s were a very troubled time for America. They were recovering from President John F. Kennedy's assassination. Then there was the Vietnam War that had absolutely split society. Then if you look at it, yet again, it was hijacked by another incident in Europe. This time, the Prague Spring Uprising. In 1968, when you looked at it, in Czechoslovakia, under Alexander Dubček, they had issued reforms. Czechoslovakia was more freer than most of the Warsaw Pact nations. But the Soviet Union decided, no, this was not meant to happen. And they invaded Prague in 1968. And a lot of Czechoslovak athletes at that time, they refused to listen to the Soviet anthem, and they were sanctioned. But perhaps the darkest and the most brutal episode that happened was 1972 Munich. The 70s was the most volatile time in the Middle East, and it culminated with Black September terrorists getting into the Olympic Village, holding the Israeli athletes hostage, and in a botched rescue operation by the West Germans, 11 Israeli athletes were killed. 1972 Munich was the darkest episode in the history of the Olympics, and after 7 years, Mossad had their ultimate revenge when they killed one of the plotters, Ali Hassan Salameh, in Beirut. in 1979. So for 7 years, Israel wanted revenge, and in 1976, when they had the opening ceremony, the flag had a black ribbon on it, which is why they commemorated what happened in 1972, and that is why security has been increased in a big way in subsequent Olympics afterwards. 1972 remains the ultimate blot on humanity, what happened with the Israeli athletes. Then when you look at 1976, at that time, it was a social issue of apartheid. 1976, Montreal saw the African nations boycott the Olympics because of the presence of New Zealand. New Zealand had defied a UN mandate that yes, there was a sporting embargo against apartheid South Africa, but they defied that mandate and they went on a rugby tour. The All Blacks went for a rugby tour. There, the UN didn't sanction New Zealand, and New Zealand were allowed to participate in the Olympics. That drew the ire of the African nations, and all of them decided to withdraw from 1976 Montreal. This was the first time that African nations took a total collective stance against apartheid South Africa. Then began in the 1980s the tit for tat Olympics in the build-up to it. In the build-up to 1980 Moscow, in the year prior to that, the USSR had invaded Kabul, they had invaded Afghanistan. And because of that, the Western nations withdrew from 1980 Moscow Olympics. Tit for tat, in 1984, the Warsaw Pact nations withdrew from the Los Angeles Olympics. 24 years later, when you looked at it, yet another incident happened. This time in 2008, the Olympics was going to be held in Beijing. And throughout the entire torch run, you saw free Tibet protests that were happening on a frequent basis. At one point, one of the individuals was carrying the torch in London. The torch was snatched away and he was pinned to the ground. And subsequent posters like this, China plays games with human rights, that was the bullet holes which marked the Olympic rings. That was a really ugly thing that happened. But Beijing Olympics hosted it, and because of that now, free Tibet has gone back into the back burner. 2024. The unfortunate reality is that you are plagued by two major world events. Russia-Ukraine, that has been going on for close to 2 years now, and because of that, Russian and Belarusian athletes have been banned in the Olympics. They can't even participate under ROC, which is the Russian Olympic Committee. But the major escalation that has happened in the Middle East comes with what has happened in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Israel has been undergoing severe, if you look at it, they have been pounding Gaza, and that has drawn the ire of the international community. Now, compared to that, there was an attack in Bordeaux during the torch rally when it happened. Islamic State apparently has claimed responsibility for that, but then nothing untoward has happened so far. But security is going to be beefed up big time in the Paris Olympics because of what is happening in both Russia, Ukraine, and in Israel, Gaza. Because of this now, when you looked at it throughout history, Olympics has had a very troubled build-up, which is why the global sporting phenomenon of the Olympics is always tied with politics and geopolitics that happens outside. For people who say that you want to separate politics from sports, it cannot happen. The Olympics is the ultimate proof of that. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us for this video. Subscribe to Sports Today for all the latest news and analysis.